Arizona Statewide Career Services Conference. I know it's been a whirlwind time for everybody, and I'm glad that you can make the time to be with us here today. And I look forward to hearing from our colleagues about what they're doing in response to COVID-19, as well as the partnerships they've developed with their community, with their campus and employers. I want to introduce you to Assistant Vice President of Access, Abra McAndrew. Actually, no, let me start that over again. I would like you to introduce you to Abra McAndrew, Assistant Vice President of Access, Engagement, and Opportunity for Student Engagement and Career Development. Welcome, Abra.
Good morning. Thanks, Kim, and welcome everybody. I want to thank you, Kim, for chairing this committee of our Arizona Statewide Conference. It's always so great to have this time each year to gather and reinvigorate our networks and connect. And although we can't do it in person, you've done just a remarkable job as a committee of flipping this to a virtual model. So thank you, Kim Matthey. And I also want to thank the other members of the committee here at the University of Arizona, Megan Garish and Marvila Rocha, who made it possible for all of you to register and be here with us today. We're so glad to have you here. And then our program proposal team, Devin Thomas, Amanda Parkman, and Ariel Torres. Thank you. Pete and Justin, Pete Corrigan, Justin Finnerty, well known to many of you, I'm sure, are planning the event, and Megan Farecki will be helping us to assess your experience with us today. So I'm really grateful to everyone for the hard work that went into making this conference possible. And so without anything further, I would like to introduce you to our special guest this morning to help us kick off this conference. You probably know of her. She's been making the rounds, with a number of broadcasts and webinars and other things to help us in our field, and has been known as a thought leader and change maker in our field for a long time. Christine Cruzvergara is here with us. She is the VP of Higher Education and Student Success at Handshake right now, leading their efforts to deepen their partnerships with our higher education community. And most recently, she was at Wellesley College as their Associate Provost for Career Education and has received national recognition in our field. So welcome, Christine.
Thank you, Abra. Excited to be here with all of you.
And so we're gonna just have a little chat here today. Christine has made herself available to talk with us. And I wanna start off, Christine, you had written an article in November 2019, which now seems like a world away. But you and Farouk Day had published an article, 5 Future Directions for Career Services. And I thought it might be great if you could kick us off today by kind of, giving us a synopsis of that and maybe discussing if any of that advice or, predictions that you have, how have those changed in this time as we're all impacted by COVID-19?
Absolutely. Thanks, Abra. So Farouk and I, in the summer of 2019, decided it would be time for us to do a little refresh on our 10 future trends that we had written 5 years ago. We really felt like both the field and the marketplace, things had changed more rapidly than we had initially expected. And we wanted to do a refresh on our model and on sort of what we were predicting for the next 10 years. So as we were looking at higher education, we were looking at the landscape of our country, we really felt that the next era of career services was about social mobility. It was about access and opportunity. It was about recognizing that the student demographics that we were all going to see across all of our different institutions, didn't matter if it was private or public, large or small, you were seeing an increased number of students of color. You're seeing an increased number of low-income students or first-gen students, right? And the reality is the system of higher education was never built for these students. It wasn't. That wasn't how our history was built. And unfortunately, over hundreds of years, our system of education, particularly higher education, has not changed. And so that system in and of itself makes it very difficult for students from underrepresented backgrounds to be able to gain access, to be able to navigate the world that they're in once they're at your institution, and to be able to make it out successfully. So we really felt, as we were looking at sort of the future of our society and our nation and our country and of our workforce, we really believed that it was our responsibility as career educators to think about that access and equity piece and to really figure out, for our institutions, how could we be that engine? How could we help to move that forward? And so there were 5 directions in particular that we felt every institution should figure out how to incorporate within the culture of their school, their college or university. So the first was really about integrating into academics. I think in the midst of COVID-19, that is even more true now than ever, when academics and online courses are actually the only thing students are actually required to do, right? We have to figure out, how does the career component get integrated into that? How is it really core to the student experience, right? That is truly, for many institutions, still the only component of a student experience that is required, and we need to figure out how we play a part in some of those pieces. The second was about scalable structures. If we're all honest with each other and we look at who we actually serve within our student demographic, there are many career centers out there that still only serve about 35% of their student population. That's 65% of students at your school that are not necessarily being touched by you or your team or getting some of the help. And some of those students are the ones who need it the most. So how do we actually flip the way in which we are organized so that we can actually scale our reach, we can touch more students, because not all students need equal amounts of help or support, right? So how do we simply rethink some of those pieces? The third is life design, teaching skills. And that's a big component that I think right now, again, in the midst of this pandemic, both pandemics, we need students that are going to be able to be nimble and agile, who are not going to feel encumbered by a set plan, but rather can continue to reinvent themselves. And so I think that continues to be very relevant. The fourth was impact over input, right? Recognizing that as we think about metrics, as we think about the story that we are weaving and telling for our senior administrators to advocate for a seat at the table, to advocate for more resources, to make sure we are core to the institutional mission, we have to make sure that we know how to talk about impact over just input, right? Who comes to your events, who comes to your advising is not nearly as important as what they're either learning coming out of it or the jobs that they are getting out of it. And I know some are listening to this and thinking, well, that really sounds a lot like placement. But the reality is we have to think about those actions in order to show that we are helping to move a student forward in their progression and in their process of being able to find opportunity. And the last is really about rewriting the narrative. Andy Chan, more than 10 years ago, really spearheaded this for our field when he put out a very controversial TEDx talk on career services must die. And if you really listen to what he says in that talk, it's really about rewriting the narrative. It's not necessarily about us eliminating the field of career services. It is about helping to reshape people's understanding of career services, because the reality is most people who don't do the work we do look at us and they think, oh, you help to do resumes, right? You put on some career fairs. They don't really understand the depth and the breadth of what it is we do and the type of impact we have, because we historically have not talked about it that way. So in reality, I think all of the stuff that we wrote in 2019, while we never could have predicted what was coming in 2020, turns out to be more true now than ever.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really found the article to be very thought-provoking. And I also, I love Andy and his talk, I think also just galvanized a lot of really important conversations. I want to follow up on what you just said about impact over input, right? And the narrative that we need to be able to tell. So I think it's really interesting to think about, what do we measure and then what story do we tell from it, right? So do you have any advice for career services professionals in thinking more about that? Because I think sometimes it can raise some fear, right? To think about, well, we have to not only reach more students, you're telling us, we have to be like more effective with those students, right? And isn't it a lot to ask to do both of those things at once, right? So what's a way to, that you would advise us to think about what we measure and how we use those measures to, motivate ourselves and to tell our story and all of that?
Yeah, so I think there are a few different components. I'm going to give you a few different strategies depending. I know everybody learns a little bit differently, so hopefully some of these will appeal to the variety of learning types that we have in the room today. So one is to really think of yourself as essentially a mini business. You yourself are an entrepreneur. Your team is your small startup, and you are trying to figure out how do you maximize the very limited resources that you have. Right? For many of you, you could essentially see yourself as a seed round company or a Series A company. You've just gotten a little bit of funding from your investors, and you were trying to figure out how to make that literally stretch as far as possible to show as much impact as possible. And if you think about it that way, if you think about the fact that who you have to pitch to, who you have to get funding from, or who you have to get support from, are a group of individuals that understand numbers and understand impact, but don't necessarily always understand the work you do, you have to draw that connection for them. And so what you often have to do in a startup is you have to pare down to the essentials. What you say no to is just as important as what you say yes to. And so when you start to think about what services or what programs you provide, you are always thinking in terms of, how am I going to reach the most students? How am I going to get them from point A to point B to point C as effectively or as quickly as possible in that process? Now, everybody obviously develops differently, so you're going to have different strategies, right? And you could essentially think of those different strategies as different playbooks for you. If you were to make more comparisons to the world of industry, which I think is always really important. When I was working in higher education, I got a lot of inspiration from actually looking at industries outside of academia in order to see how do they function and what can I take from them? What practices can I take that can help inform the work that I do, right? One of the things I recently have been talking to a couple of colleagues about is they've been really intrigued by how sales pipelines work within industry. So for any of you that have worked in sales before, typically you are assigned sort of a book of business, okay? And out of your book of business, you have a certain number of targets that you're sort of going after. And every week you meet with your team and you meet with your supervisor and you do something called a pipeline review. And you literally go account by account by account, and you have to give a status update. How is that account doing? Have you reached out to that account? What are the blockers for that account? What are their challenges or issues? What are your strategies for how you're going to help unblock them? And if you don't know, you pose that question to your team to get their advice and to get their help. Now imagine if we actually did that with our students. If we were to actually split our students across the team, each person on our team had a group of students that you were responsible for, and you had the diligence of actually going through every week. How is Abra doing? How is Kim doing? What is Christine's blocker? How can we help her? Who is she most interested in? Who are the employers that these students are? You're going to start to see trend lines and patterns in a way that you haven't seen before because you haven't been as close to it, right? You've been waiting for students to come to you, or you mark it out and you grab some students, but you haven't been really proactively going after some of those students. So that's one way to think about it. I think the other way to think about it when you look at impact and you look at some of the stats is to think about what are the actions that have to happen in order for a student to actually obtain a good opportunity. So in my article, one of the things that we talk about is in order to get any opportunity, there is literally one action that every student must take for that to happen. And the action is apply. Every student has to actually pull the trigger and apply. I was just talking to a great colleague at University of Illinois recently, and she said, you know, our students will often tell us they've been doing the job search for 6 months. They seem to not get responses. They're not sure why they aren't hearing back. And she'll ask the question, how many have you actually applied to? And they're like 3, 4, right? And I know some of you are probably chuckling because you have this exact same conversation with your students. She's like, that's not enough. You scrolling and looking at job descriptions is not going to get you a job. You have to actually apply. You have to take that leap. So as career educators, what might we be able to do to actually track and sort of see how many students are we actually even able to get to that point of application, right? That's something that you actually have direct influence over. If they're not applying, why are they not applying? Is it because they don't know how to apply? Is it because they don't know how to put their materials together? Is it because they don't know what they want to do? Or is it certain populations in your organization or in your institution that are not applying, in which case you need different intervention? So being able to look at some of those impact stats will allow you to actually back up and do the correct preventative strategies that you need for your institution.
Yeah, we've added that as one of our outcomes that we're tracking across our department as well for the students that we're able to interact with. So it'll be interesting to see.
That's fantastic.
What we learn, right, from that experience. And I think that you described of learning, right, and tracking trends and things, that's really important. So it's not about, you know, one individual, it's about what's happening, you know, across the landscape, but then it comes back to what do we do for that one individual? So the personalization that needs to come along or, you know, be part of the strategy as well. So great. Well, let's talk a little bit about Handshake. You know, speaking of startups, right, in our field. So one thing, you know, you communicated with all of us recently, and I think, you know, it was very helpful to see Handshake acknowledge, you know, the issues of structural racism that are happening right now and have been happening, and to then think about how to translate that to the sphere of our work, right? Talent development and connection between talent, college talent, and employers. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, it seemed in that communication that you were starting to hold the company accountable and be accountable to all of us and to students to ensure that the impact that Handshake's having on Black students' careers is actually helping them, and it's actually helping overall at scale to create greater equity in career outcomes for college students. So I was wondering if you could share more about how you're thinking about that, how you're measuring that or tracking progress towards that impact in a world, where we know those structural disadvantages are they're baked in, and there's a role that all of the partners have in furthering more equitable outcomes.
Yeah, it's a really timely question, Abra. So I sent out that communication about 2.5 weeks ago, and we're actually in the process of putting together an updated communication that I'll be sending out later this week to all of our partners as well. So there are a few different components in how we're looking at this work. We've essentially split it into 4 different work streams across our company. The first work stream is the individual. So one of the things that we obviously are very cognizant of and that we are continuing to learn is that you cannot do external work if you do not do internal work first. And so that really starts with each of us as an individual, each of us doing the work to understand how we contribute to systems of racism and systems of oppression, how we use our privilege and power. And quite frankly, all of us, the majority of you probably come from a student affairs background that are sitting here in this room today. You learned this in grad school. You learned racial identity development in grad school, and you know how painful and how hard that process is. And everybody in any organization, whether it's your career center or it's Handshake, we're all at different developmental levels. And we all have to do the work in order to do that. I can't do the work on behalf of the entire company, just as you can't do the work on behalf of your entire career center. So the first work stream is individually grappling with that, learning, listening, participating in those conversations, and really making sure that this becomes a more regular part of our daily lives. And that is manifesting itself in different team meetings, team conversations. We're reading articles together. We're watching things together. We have different employee resource groups where we're getting together to have this as a more regular conversation. So we're finding ways to structurally embed the conversation into our day-to-day until it becomes not uncomfortable and just what we do. It is just part of the context and how we do our work. So that's the first work stream. The second work stream that we're looking at is Handshake as a company internally and as an entity. So what does our hiring look like? What does our promotion process look like? How do we think about who's on leadership and who's at the board level? And so we've always tracked sort of how we do against sort of all racial diversity as well as gender. We've always shared that internally. It's part of the conversation right now in terms of whether or not that will be shared more widely. I am happy to share with this group that we actually have, I believe, nearly 40% or 45% people of color within our organization overall. However, where we really lack is in the most senior level positions. So I'm on the exec team, for example. I am the only woman of color on the exec team. I'm only one of 2 women on the exec team. We don't have any Latinx or Black individuals on our exec team, right? So those are areas where we need to continue to do better. And we are putting plans in place around, as we continue to hire, what will that look like? And how will we make sure that we have a diverse applicant pool so that we are looking at that actively? The third work stream is really about our product and our processes. So again, you're only as good as the people that you have on your team, which is why the first 2 work streams are so important to us. But what we also want to do is we want to embed in the product process that we do checks and balances for ourselves to make sure that as we build out components, as we build out different features, we are thinking about what that impact is going to have for different groups of students. For example, a PRD is something that you put together in the product process to essentially outline in great detail everything that you are about to build out and all the implications that you have to the other parts of the platform and the other parts of the business. Something in there, we could have a checklist or we could have something in there that's embedded where we either need to check with a new committee of folks that might be part of our inclusion committee that's looking at everything we build from that lens, and that they're asking questions and challenging the product managers on that as we go through. It could be something to make sure that we are simply making a conscious effort to look at what is the impact and can we actually note the impact using data on our white students, our Black students, our Latinx students, so on and so forth, right? So those are some of the processes that we're discussing and putting into place. That's going to take a little bit longer. We'll probably be about 3 to 6 months out in terms of how long it will take us to really kind of wrestle with that and come up with some good processes there. That part, that work stream will also include how do we solicit ideas from our partners who might have really wonderful thoughts that we can also incorporate into this process. As many of you know, we revamped the product process last fall to make sure that we were including our partners more in all of the different stages of the product process. So this will be one component of that embedded into one of the 5 steps. And what should that look like? And then finally, the last one is our ecosystem and our platform. So as we said in the email, we're fortunate that we have the privilege of having this platform now where we sit at the nexus of, we're super excited. Just a couple weeks ago, we hit over 1,000 institutions that we now partner with, which is really exciting. And we partner with over 450,000 employers. So what does that look like in terms of how we can both help educate our university partners, but also our employer partners, and vice versa? How do we learn from you? I was just talking with our VP for Enterprise Product yesterday, and we were saying, you know, we need to think about what ways in which can we help employers think about their own culture and their own environment so that as universities are helping their students to send them to different places, those employers are equipped and also ready to answer some of the hard questions that they should be equipped to answer, right? And what does that look like? And how do we help employers remove bias from their interview process or from their recruiting process? What does that all look like? So those are the different types of conversations that we're currently having. And to be perfectly honest, this is really ongoing. So we're going to be tracking and measuring and looking at this for years to come. It certainly is not a one and done kind of deal.
Yeah. Creating equitable systems is not a one and done kind of deal. So I really appreciate that comprehensive and thoughtful approach. And I think there are things from that we can probably adapt to our own equity audits and things that we are starting to talk about or think about within, you know, our departments maybe as well. So that was really helpful. Thank you. A follow-up question. I mean, it's a little bit of a tangent, but I appreciated what you were just saying about, you know, at the end of the day, it comes down to bias in hiring processes, and it comes down to, you know, mutually educating each other and supporting each other to eliminate those and all of that. And I think that some folks, maybe in the employer relations field here within the universities, they've been wondering a lot about like what, you know, things are changing with the way, you know, Handshake now is supporting 450,000 employers, like the product has really evolved. It's really meeting the needs of employers in a different way, right? But it's created some necessitation of change from us, right? In terms of how we think about our sponsorships or our partnerships or things like that with employers. And so talk a little bit, you know, knowing where your product is going and your roadmap and all the success and progress that you've made. And, you know, having sat in our place as well, you know what that means for us, right? And so in particular, around like needing to change our revenue model or think differently about who, you know, how we're engaging employers in that way. So could you talk a little bit about what you would advise us to do, right, to continue to all be successful and be good partners?
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the biggest things to keep in mind is we've been watching and following kind of the trends of where employers have been wanting to go for some time now. So prior to COVID-19, we were already hearing a lot of employers wanting to develop virtual strategies for their recruitment. Now, the impetus for a lot of that was either one, they were getting cuts to their own budget, which I know many of you can understand and sort of feel that pain. So one was that. The second was they were trying to diversify their workforce. And by having a more digital strategy, they could actually do that, right? COVID-19 simply accelerated a trend that we were already seeing. If COVID had never happened, my guess is that it would have taken probably about another 3 to 5 years for employers to really work closely with university partners to get more universities comfortable with the shift to virtual, right? There were some employers like GM, for example, that had already kind of like, they pulled the trigger, they made that switch really fast last year, and they left a lot of their university partners sort of in a lurch around like, oh my God, GM's one of our biggest employers and they're not coming to campus anymore. And they had to very quickly kind of figure out what that was going to look like. But for the majority of employers, they felt sort of the resistance and the hesitation from universities, and they decided to take a slightly slower route to get there. When COVID-19 hit, what we kept hearing from employers was, oh my gosh, this is accelerating everything that we've been wanting. So do you think that the universities will actually be really open to this? And that's part of what you've heard from me in some of the different webinars and things that we've been talking about, which is this actually affords all of us in this ecosystem an opportunity for your student to be found in ways that they might not have been found before. in ways for you to be able to build relationships with employers that you might not have been able to before. And so this can actually be a really wonderful opportunity rather than a really scary piece. And so in order to work better together as we continue to move forward into whatever is going to be our new normal, I think what's really critical is to actually be open to thinking about, well, what will be different about my role, right? If I'm not necessarily needed in the same ways that it was before with in-person, what role do I play now? And I think that's a really critical question that you should be asking for the employer team especially. You should be asking every employer that you're talking to. Now you have virtual recruiting. Not only can you participate in a virtual fair, which as a university you might be hosting, but you can also host your own virtual events and invite students from across multiple institutions. So if you're able to do that and you're able to find some of the students across very diverse paths to be able to be in your applicant pool, what is it that I can provide that you still can't get from a platform or you still can't get from your own virtual sort of engagement tools? What does that look like for you? What I will share, that I have asked this question to multiple employers, they share a couple of things with me. So the first is, you know your institution and your institution's culture better than anybody else. And they often have a hard time figuring out what are the right words or what are the right skills or what are the right things that I should be using in order to ensure that some of those students from your school are going to end up in my search and are going to end up in my pool, right? So how do you help them to sort of delineate that piece of it? The second is they often say, I would love for career centers to really be true connectors. I know some of you have actually probably seen some of the things that Farouk has been posting over the past several months about we really need to actually make the facilitated connection and that introduction between employers and students. The employers are echoing that. They're saying, especially those, let's actually just take one employer, for example, because I think it'll be easier to bring it to life. Let's take Target. I was talking to Target recently. They're obviously a big name brand. Everybody knows who Target is. However, they're not a brand where most students are thinking, I just got a 4-year degree and I'm really excited to go work at Target, right? They don't have that brand and that affinity in that way because students don't understand the work that they're doing. And so one of the things that Target said would be super helpful is I would love to be able to go to an institution, Abra, I'll just pick on you, and for Abra to say, you know what, based on the type of role that you have and the skill sets that you're looking for and the profile of candidate that you want, I actually think a pocket of some of the athletes over here would potentially be really good for you. A pocket of students from the English department over here might be really helpful for you. A pocket of students here that's in this student group might be really helpful for you. Let me help facilitate an event where I can bring all of those students together for you and you can be present and I can help facilitate some of that introduction and help essentially be the translator, because that's really what it comes down to is translation of what is the company interested in and what are they looking for and what opportunity can they actually provide to a student, and you helping the student to understand that that's actually very similar to what it is they're looking for, even if they hadn't initially thought that Target would be the place where they might get that opportunity. So some of that curation around truly facilitating the introductions, I think is also a really interesting piece for us to continue to think about. But I'm going to continue to ask the question. I hope you will continue to ask the question, and we should keep this conversation going because I think people are still trying to figure out exactly what that looks like as we move into the next 6 months.
Yeah, thank you. My last question is just about that, right? With roles changing and needing to think like that. We have a number of folks attending with us today that have maybe just entered the field or, still figuring out, how they want to pursue their career in the field. So what would you say in terms of professional identity for those looking to advance careers in this field? What's most important for success in our field in the future?
Wow, that's a big question, Abra. I think, I think one of the most important things is being able to stay incredibly nimble and agile. I don't want you to just be nimble and agile for higher ed. I need you to be nimble and agile, period, right? You need to be considered nimble and agile in industry, because the reality is higher ed hasn't changed for a really long time. And I know many of you are frustrated and are feeling some of that hesitation and that resistance within your own institutions as you try and plan and figure out what you're going to do for the fall. And the reality is our marketplace is not going to it's not going to slow down in any sort of way. The changes are not going to become farther and fewer between. They're going to become more fast and rapid as we move forward. And so I think one of the best skills that you can probably practice for yourself is literally being able to be agile and nimble and not afraid of change, and the willingness to look at something with new parameters and to actually challenge yourself to say, okay, this is different than what I'm used to, but what's the possibility here? Or how could I redesign or rethink about the way I've approached this, rather than trying to continue to fit sort of this square peg in a round hole, right? And getting frustrated that things have changed around you, right?
Yeah.
I think that's going to be a really core and critical piece to how we look at things.
Yeah, and last question that's coming from one of our participants
Sure.
here. How would you say, you know, the role of faculty in that, right? Because sometimes maybe where we sit, it looks like they're the ones who won't change, right? Or, you know, and, you know, I think that there's maybe some good reasons for that, right, too. So what
Yep.
would you say, you know, in terms of that, if academic integration is so important, right? What should we keep in mind with faculty based on your experience?
Yeah, anytime you're thinking about persuasion or buy-in, it starts with meeting people where they are and getting them to where you want to go, right? In many ways, that's not different when we talk about racial injustice and social justice and where we want to see things going in our society. It's not any different when we think about our career work. So I'll give you a really quick example from Wellesley. Your language is so important in how you meet people where they are and how you help them feel heard so that they can be part of this process. When I was at Wellesley, I was talking to an English faculty member. Great conversation. I get towards the end of it and I say, wow, this was so wonderful. I'm so excited to partner with you. And I can't wait to help our students be the most competitive possible in whatever industry they wish to pursue. And she had the most visceral reaction. I mean, she just about fell out of her chair and she was like, absolutely not. I will not work with you to do that. And I was like, why? And exactly for her, when I said the word industry, that signaled to her that I meant I wanted to try and funnel all students to finance, tech, and consulting, right? That was how she read that word. You and I know that education is an industry, nonprofit is an industry, publishing is an industry. So instead of getting offended, I asked her the question, well, tell me why. What do you want your students to go into? And she listed nonprofits, museums, education, right? Essentially all these industries. And I was able to say, oh my gosh, so helpful to know that that's what you were thinking. When I use the word industry, I was referring to all industries, including the ones that you meant, but I'm so curious, when I said the word industry, what did you think? And to give her the space to be able to have that conversation, right? And so the language you use and the way in which you talk with your faculty to both hear them and understand them is super critical. And Abra, I know your entire conference is about partnerships. And I want to emphasize that that piece is actually critical as we work with employers. And we also work with tech in our field, because we all have our own jargon. We all have our own words and phrases that we use. And sometimes we hear it, we have a visceral reaction, and we shut down. And we're not willing to continue the conversation or to ask curious questions in order to really think about, are we actually more aligned than we think, right, in the way that we want to work? And so I'll leave you with one last thought. Paul LeBlanc, when he was talking about the future, said, for a long time, higher education has used technology more as a utility and not as a partner. And I think the time has come where we truly have to think of all the entities in our ecosystem, technology included as part of that ecosystem, with employers and with students as truly partners with higher education, and thinking through these really big systemic issues that we're all trying to tackle and break down and redesign.
Thank you so much, Christine. You can't hear applause, but feel free to applaud everyone. Christine's discussion today. It was really great to have you here with us in Arizona for our statewide conference. And one of the opportunities that this time of doing everything remotely made possible for us. So thank you very much. I'd like to turn it back over to you, Kim, if you have some housekeeping or anything like that for the group.
No, I just want to thank everybody for being here, and you should have the links to all the additional sessions that are going on today at 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. And you can also stay behind on those meetings when they're over for more question and answers. Unfortunately, we ran out of time today, but I will post this recording on our website after this event. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Awesome.
See you.
Thank you.